Have you ever felt like you had your life finally put together just the way you wanted it, only to have it fall apart? I want to share with you a nightmare that lasted for a year. During that time, my finances were under siege, my sense of self-worth and identity had fallen apart, and I had my skull taken apart and put back together. And it's not so much about what happened, but rather how, like the neurosurgeon who pieced together my skull with titanium plates, I reconstructed my life with elements from my past with the help of friends and family. For 23 years, I knew who I was. I served in the Navy aboard submarines, and my purpose was to protect the world against nuclear annihilation. I served for months at a time under the waves in cramped quarters with strangers who eventually became closer than friends. Together, we did that hard and dangerous work, all in the expectation that our sacrifices and those of our families at home help keep the world safe. Now, I don't say any of this to portray myself as a hero. When I joined the Navy straight out of high school, I was a mess, and I counted on them to straighten me out. But after it was all over, I had no idea how to adjust to civilian life. I'd never had to fill out a job application. I'd never had to write a resume. I ended up as a night desk clerk in a cheap motel for minimum wage. I ended up in this motel lobby with plenty of time to think. And I wondered, am I worth less now than I was then? My paycheck said that I was. Or maybe I'd been deluded all along. I got to work looking for other jobs, a career that would capitalize on my experience so that I could earn a comparable wage. But I also thought about how I had this huge hole in my life where the Navy had been. I had invested so much time and spent so much of it away from home that though I was a husband and a father, I hardly knew my wife or our son. I had invested the bulk of my time and the bulk of my identity into my profession. So now I ask myself, who am I now? And how am I going to define that? I had always considered my identity based off of an old saying, that we shall be known by the fruits of our labors. I had considered that my career in the Navy provided good fruit in nuclear deterrence, a degree of world peace. But my job at the motel was nothing but a paycheck. I had to find an identity that was separate from my profession, one that once I left here, I could take it with me wherever I went. So in order to forge this future, I had to examine my past before I joined the Navy. Now, as a child, I had no idea what it meant to be on the autism spectrum or to have Asperger's syndrome. I didn't find out about those things until my son and subsequently myself were diagnosed. But I knew that I was different. At times, I felt so different that I imagined that I was this alien orphan dropped off on my human parents' doorstep, and that one day my real parents would come back and take me to my real home, a place where who I was and how I responded to the world made sense compared to those around me. In my teens, I found a way to connect with those normal humans through storytelling. In my senior high school English class, the teacher would put up a writing prompt, put on an album, and let us write while she graded the week's papers. Near the end of class, she would ask for volunteers to share what we'd written. And in those moments where I shared my story, and my classmates laughed or gasped at just the right moments in those stories, it felt magical. I had found a way to connect with these people. So, in that motel lobby, thinking about all this, I chose to partner with my childhood friend and share my imagination again. I would become a writer. That would be the identity I would carry with me. Eventually, I moved on to 2 other jobs. The first one put me in very familiar territory. I was back out at sea doing dangerous work, this time in the offshore oil industry. I was working on robot submarines. Super cool tech, very dangerous, but thankfully it paid the bills. And then I moved on to a rusted out, nasty warehouse as an assembler. And as bad as that was, I was thankful because I got to come home at the end of every day. I just want to pause and mention that I was thankful each time I got a job for something new. And I think that's important for people to look for. But I digress. So then came the day when my wife noticed my right eye. Despite it being a bright, sunny summer day, it was fully dilated. After a series of doctor's visits, we found out that I had a brain tumor. It was about the size of a plum. It was wrapped around my optic nerve and it was strangling it. And it would continue to grow unless something was done. I went through a series of surgeries. After the first one, I went through a coma. I lost my voice for a month because of some of the damage that was done getting intubated. And when it was all over, and I called my employer and told him that I was finally ready to come back to work, he told me that the position had been filled. So I went back to the only place I knew would take me back, and that was that cheap motel. I was back in that motel lobby, and once again, I had plenty to think about. And I realized how little I had done to realize my dream of being a writer. I had written pages and pages in those nights in the motel a month ago. But would it make sense to anybody else? Could I count on those pages to evoke the kind of emotional connection that I was looking for? I dedicated myself right then to aggressively and actively pursue my goal of being a writer. I read a number of books on how to tell a story more effectively. I scheduled time to write instead of just writing whenever I had the spare time. And I joined a writer's group where I received some much needed constructive criticism. Highly recommended. And when that writer's group reached a point where they argued more about the moral dilemma of the story that I was telling rather than how I told it, that's when I realized I'd found that connection again. That's when I realized I was on the right path. And you may remember those strangers that I mentioned, that I served with, that were closer than friends. One of them reached out to me. He knew my whole story, and he helped me apply for a job, testing the missiles I used to take out at sea. It is the best job I have ever had. I've been there for 15 years now. And despite how great that job is, it doesn't come close to defining who I am. I've published a handful of novels, a handful of short stories. I've taken on some jobs editing so that I can share what I've learned. And I've even facilitated my own writers group to give back some of that constructive criticism. A writer friend of mine has been urging me for a number of years now to come out and talk to you. She finally convinced me that I had a story to tell. I'd love to have more time with you and tell you all the stories. My stories have stories. But I'm going to try to stay focused on the point at hand and carry on with the main issue. And it's this. You know, it wasn't about what happened to me during that crazy year. It's about what I learned and discovered about myself going through it. We all work so hard to keep the lights on in our house that we forget about the light in our heart. Having learned that lesson, I cannot help but feel a burning desire to share that with others whose professional lives lack personal fulfillment. Some of the things that I learned while I was going through all that, finally recalled that I learned things. I was put in that motel lobby to think about how I considered my sense of self-worth and my identity. I also learned to appreciate the underappreciated by becoming one. And finally, I understood the importance of personally having a purpose. We all have this life that so many of us have of just being a worker bee and trying to eke out some sort of relaxation or restorative powers from the weekends between. And what I'm suggesting is that you examine your past. Look for a moment where you had a passion and you've since dropped it because the world kept you too busy. Reach back for that. Breathe life into that. And bring balance to your today. That's all I have. Thank you.